Hey folks, it's Pierre with Pierre Andrews Photography, and today I'm going to show you how to shoot in manual and stop shooting in automatic mode. Stop shooting in automatic mode. Why? Well, because you have much less control than you do when you're in manual mode. I'm going to talk through the three main factors that comprise your manual mode and how to control those factors to create a properly exposed shot. First of all, an example as to why you wouldn't want to shoot in manual mode is this one, or excuse me, in automatic mode is this one. I'm going to set my camera to automatic mode. And I'm going to want to take a picture of the camera that's filming me right now, and I want that camera to be properly exposed. Behind the camera is a large patio door with windows that's letting in the light. Watch. As you can see from the picture, the camera that I'm trying to expose for is dark. That's because the lens or the camera exposed for the bright windows to make the background not overexposed. So it basically wanted to create a properly exposed shot for the whole scene. So in order for me to be able to see the camera in the shot clearly and so that it's not dark and underexposed, I need to shoot in manual mode. So I'm going to talk to you about the three factors of manual mode. First, you have the f-stop or the aperture. First, let's switch into manual mode together. F-stop or aperture decides, one, how much light gets let into your camera, and two, it dictates your depth of field. What's going to be blurry, what's going to be in focus. The lower your number, this lens goes down to 2.8. Different lenses have different minimum numbers. Some are fixed, which means as I change that number, or excuse me, as I zoom in and out, the number is going to stay constant, which is hence a fixed one. Those tend to be more expensive. This is a fixed 2.8 aperture, which means at the lowest I can go down to 2.8, and no matter if I zoom in or out, it's going to stay at 2.8. Other lenses, as you zoom in and out, that number fluctuates. So the lower the number, the more light gets let in, the easier it is to get a properly exposed shot. But the lower the number, the less depth of field you get, which means if I shoot something that's close up, everything behind it might be blurry if I keep my number down at 2.8. I'm going to show you exactly what that looks like. First off, I'm going to set my f-stop down to 2.8, and then I'm going to properly expose the rest of the shot. Hold on, give me a second. Okay, so first off, I'm going to focus on the antibacterial soap. As you can see from the shot, the antibacterial soap in the front is in focus, the Tide is somewhat blurry, and then the candle in the back middle top is quite blurry. This is what I mean by depth of field. At a low aperture, like the low aperture number, which means the lens is open and letting in a lot of light, you have very little depth of field. Now I'm going to focus on the Tide. Take a picture. Now as you can see, the Tide is in focus, the candle in the back is a little bit more in focus than it was before, and now the antibacterial soap in the front is out of focus. And then finally I will focus on the candle. And as you can see now, the candle is in focus and the other two are not. This is great for when you're trying to shoot a single subject and you're trying to draw focus towards that subject. It's great for certain portrait shots. It's not so great for group shots because if somebody is standing behind somebody, even by like a distance of a foot, much like these items, one person will be in focus and the other one won't be. So how do we fix that? Well, we raise and we raise the aperture number. So there's no tell-all rule for distances. Well, I don't know any rules for distances versus your aperture, so you kind of have to play with the number. But I'm going to raise my f-stop or aperture number up to 7.1. Okay, and I'm going to properly expose for that. And we'll see what we get here. Okay, as you can see, shooting at f7.1, all three are somewhat in focus. The Germ X in the front there is not completely in focus, and the calm candle is not also completely in focus because I was actually focusing on the tide. But if I were to raise the f-stop number more, let's go up to f11, okay? And let me change my settings, so, okay. As you can see, it's gotten a little bit better. The tide is the Germex and the calm candle are now both in pretty good focus. The more I raise that number, the more even the scene's going to be, and that way you can get everything kind of in focus. So this is great for portraiture work, so that you don't get one person out of focus and another one in focus. The problem with raising the f-stop when you don't have any flash and you're using just the ambient light, the daylight, is that the more you raise that number, the smaller the hole on the lens, this hole in the middle, which therefore lets in less light. If you let in less light, you have to mess with other factors to let more light in, and we'll talk about that next. The second factor in creating a properly exposed shot in manual is your ISO. ISO determines how sensitive the body, your camera body, is to the light that's coming in through the lens. The higher your ISO number, the more sensitive it's going to become. So if you're shooting in very low light situations, it's good to be able to boost that number up if you don't have a flash. The problem is if you boost that ISO number too much, then you're going to create what's called noise or grain. If you've seen grainy shots, that's because the ISO was boosted way up because the room was slightly dark. So in order to make it a properly exposed shot, then they had to raise the ISO. So my rule of thumb is I always like to keep my ISO at 100, the lowest number possible for my camera, when I'm first starting off. Then I'll raise it if I need to put in more light. So in this case, I'm in a room with a good amount of light coming in, but not that much. If I were straight outside, it'd be a lot easier, but I'm inside. I'm going to start with my ISO 100, and we're going to see how the ISO and the aperture correlate with each other. Well, first of all, if I wanted to get these three items in focus, like I said, I would have to shoot at around f11, which is going to let in a lot less light. So for me to create a properly exposed shot, I would have to raise my ISO in this case. In this case, I had to raise it up to 6400, which is quite a bit, given the fact that my aperture was set at f11, which is a pretty high number. So the other option is, yes, I could lower my aperture back down to 2.8, and therefore I wouldn't have to raise the ISO as much. But the problem is, if I want to get all three items in focus, that's not a possibility for me. If these, for example, if these three items were people and I was shooting them, and they needed to be in focus, I would have to shoot at aperture f11, and therefore would have to raise my ISO to what I had it at before, which was 6400. And that's really what a big factor of what you're paying for when you get a good body. You're paying for being able to shoot at high ISOs and getting a little noise or a little bit of that grain. And so, you know, cheaper cameras tend to have more grain at lower ISOs, and more expensive ones tend to have less grain at higher ISOs. In this case, I have to raise my ISO all the way up to, like I said, around 6400 to get a properly exposed shot. How do I know what's going to create a properly exposed shot? I'll get to that in a little bit. So as you can see, the ISO and the aperture are directly related. Now, if I wanted to just get the Germex bottle in focus, I could raise my aperture back down to 2.8, and now I would have to lower my ISO back down because now the body's being too sensitive to light, and it will be an overexposed shot. As you can see, I'll take a picture with my ISO back at 6400, up at 6400, and as you can see from the shot, it's completely blown out because the ISO is set too high, therefore the body is being too sensitive to the light. So I have to set my ISO back down to 100, and we'll see how it looks there. At 100, at ISO 2.8 works fine. As you can see, the Germex is in focus and the other two items aren't, and my ISO is at 100. So let's now talk about the third factor in creating a properly exposed shot while shooting in manual. The third factor is shutter speed. Now, since I'm shooting still life here, shutter speed doesn't play that much of a factor. The only factor that it plays in here is avoiding camera shake. Regardless of how stable your hands are, it's always going to introduce a bit of camera wobbliness or shake. Some lenses have what's called image stabilization, where they can stabilize your shots. This lens doesn't. But a good rule of thumb is I like to keep my shutter speed at around 1/100th of a second to be able to keep the shot still and avoid any camera shake. Watch, I'm going to set my shutter speed down to 1/25th of a second. I'm going to take a picture. That's not that bad. Let me shake it around a little bit more. As you can see from this shot, there's some camera shake. So if you're working in quick camera situations where you have to take quick shots, you don't want to get that kind of blur. You want it to be nice and still. So a good rule of thumb for me is I like to shoot at around 1/100th of a second. If you have that image stabilization on your lens, you could probably bring it down to as low as 1/30th of a second without getting kind of any kind of blur. Now that takes care of my hands and keeping the shot still in still life, but let's just say my subjects are moving. How do I keep those still? It's different for every single object. I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to wave my hand in front of the camera, and I'm going to be shooting at 1/100th of a second, like I have it set now, and I'm going to set it to 1/100th of a second. There you go. And now I'm going to put my hand in front of the lens, and I'm going to shake my hand, and as you can see, there's blur. My hand is blurry, which means the shutter speed is too low to properly freeze my hand. Now this is a desired effect if you want to create that blur motion. That's more of a creative effect. So maybe I have to go all the way up to, let's say, I'm just going to go up to 500 to see how that turns out. Alright, there you go. As you can see, my hand is still, even though I was moving it quite fast, and I had to raise my shutter speed to 1/500th of a second. Now, let's talk about how all three correlate with each other. Just in that instance where I was moving my hand quickly, I had to raise my shutter speed. When you raise your shutter speed, the shutter stays open for less period of time. 1/500th of a second is much shorter than 1/100th of a second. So the higher you raise that number, the shorter your shutter speed is going to be. The problem with that is that it lets in less light because it's taking a shorter frame of that motion that I'm doing, a shorter frame in time of that motion. So in order for me to have properly exposed for that 1/500th of a second, I had to raise my ISO all the way up to 3200. My aperture was already down at 2.8, so there's no way I could let in any more light, okay? It was down at 2.8, I was letting in as much light, my aperture can't go any lower with this lens. So I had to raise my ISO to 3200 in order to create a properly exposed shot. Now let's create a problem. We're in this room, there's three subjects. The Germex, the Tide, and the Candle are now three people. And they're moving about, looking around, maybe they're looking left and right, they're talking to each other, so there's a bit of motion there, and I want to make sure that I can freeze them. At 1/100th of a second, I might get some blur if somebody moves suddenly like this. So let's just say I want to shoot them at 1/500th of a second, and I want to raise my f-stop back to f11 because I want all three of these subjects to be in focus because they're not on the same plane. One's a little bit behind the other, one's a little bit behind the other. And even if you think you've got a shot where people are standing shoulder to shoulder, even if somebody's backed up just a little bit from somebody else, that can be enough to cause them not to be in focus. So I'm raising my f-stop to f11 to make sure I have that depth of field. The problem with raising that f-stop again is that my camera's letting in less light, so I have to let in more light. Well, the problem with that is that I've raised my shutter speed up to 500, so I'm letting in even less light. So the only way that I can get a properly exposed shot is if I keep raising my ISO to create enough sensitivity in the light to create a properly exposed shot. So I'm going to raise my ISO to see how high I need to raise it to create a properly exposed shot. Okay, well, as you can see in these conditions, this is a very good camera body. I've raised my ISO up to 25,600, which most camera bodies can't. This is a 5D Mark III. I've raised it to 25,600, and check out the shot. It's still underexposed. Now, 25,600 is gonna leave in a lot of grain with this camera. I couldn't take a shot at 25,600 ISO and keep it for any kind of editorial or posting purposes or anything for my portfolio. That's just too high of an ISO. So in a case like this, if I wanted to get all three subjects in focus, and I wanted to keep my shutter speed high enough to where they wouldn't be moving, I would either need to go outside and get more light into this situation, maybe turn on some lights overhead or get the sunlight, or use a flash. So in this situation, there's only so much light coming in, I only have so many options. Now I'm going to show you how to properly expose for your shots with proper metering. We know that aperture controls depth of field and how much light gets let into the camera. We know that your ISO controls the light sensitivity. The higher your ISO number, the brighter the shot's going to be. And shutter speed controls how fast the shutter moves open and close. So the higher your shutter speed, the higher that number, the quicker it's going to open and close, which is good to freeze motion and such. So how do we correlate all three, and how do we create an exposed shot? Well, first of all, you need to look through through your viewfinder, and at the bottom there, if you lightly press the shutter, don't press it all the way, but if you lightly half press it, you'll see a meter there, a bar, and as you move it around and you keep your eye on it, you'll see that meter, a line moving across that bar. The more the meter, that bar, moves to the right, the more overexposed your shot's going to be. The more it moves to the left, the more underexposed your shot's going to be. So the goal is to kind of line that moving line up with the center of the bar to create a properly exposed shot. Now, there are different meter settings which basically decide how your camera is deciding what creates a properly exposed shot. Let's just say if I'm shooting directly into this window, well, if I expose right now in manual mode and try to get, I'm going to lower my ISO all the way back down to 100, okay, because I want to create as little noise as possible, like I said. So that's my last line of defense to getting more light in, is to raise my ISO. But since I only have one subject in this case, which is the camera that's filming me, I can lower my aperture back down to 2.8, which is going to let in a lot of light. So at this point now, let's move I'm moving my shutter speed, and to create a properly exposed shot, I have to shoot at 1/30th of a second, which is too slow. So I'm going to raise it back to 100, and I'm still underexposed by about a stop, which is 3 of those little increments. So I have to raise my ISO. I'm going to raise it to, say, 400. Okay, that looks about right. So now, I've got my camera on my viewfinder on the camera that I'm shooting. I'm going to take a shot, and as you can see here, the camera, the meter in the center, is telling me that if I line my bar up with the middle, I'll create a properly exposed shot for the entire scene. Well, the problem with this is that the entire scene, to my camera's mind, is the window. So if you look now, the background, the window is properly exposed, but the camera itself, the camera body that I want to have properly exposed, the camera that that's shooting me, is still dark. So I need to, in this case, overexpose what the meter is telling me to do. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually going past the line so that it ends up more to the right, towards the 1 number that's on the right. If I do that, you can see now the background is starting to become blown out or look really white, and that's because I'm trying to properly expose for the camera that's in the foreground, the camera that's black. Now the camera, as you can see, is still too dark. I need to overexpose the shot even more, okay? So I'm going to lower my shutter speed. I can't really lower it much more, so I have to raise my ISO some more. I'm going to raise my ISO to 1600, and now I've overexposed by 2 stops to the number 2. Let's see if the camera looks good now. Alright, as you can see, the camera is much much more visible. We can kind of see the label there at the top, but you can see the windows are completely blown out. So it comes with a compromise. You have to choose what your subject is and what you're trying to expose for. If I wanted to get a cool silhouette effect, then I could bring my my exposure back down, and as you can see, now the camera is a little bit more of a silhouette. So this is where you truly get control from shooting in manual mode. There's different types of metering now, which I'll talk to you about on my next blog. If you have any questions, send me a message on YouTube, subscribe to my channel, visit my Facebook at facebook.com/Pierre Andrews Photography, and visit my blog at pierreandrews.com/blog. Thanks so much, guys. Have a good one.